Hi everybody and welcome to Two Out the First for today, October the 18th, 2022. I am Ryan Ballinger. Good to have you with us, whether it's on video on our website, golfnewsnet.com, or on our YouTube channel, or where you listen to us on audio through your favorite podcasting service. Thanks for joining us today. We are presented by our friends at French Lick Resort. We have two stories for you today, as the name of the show implies, and they're both kind of not really golf specific related. They are golf important. They're important to golf, but they're not golf specific to the action that's going to be happening this week inside the ropes on the major tours around the world. But the first piece of news is actually pretty interesting, and it came out just a little bit before we started recording this. And it was from Eamon Lynch of Golf Week, who is one of those maybe 3 or 4 reporters who have been all over the entire LIV PGA Tour drama of the last really close to a year at this point. And Eamon in particular is well sourced within the PGA Tour and has a really good idea of things that are coming from the PGA Tour side of things to a degree, maybe not to the same degree, but pretty close to the same degree about LIV. But really, things about PGA Tour related moves or measures, Eamon's your guy. And he reported this morning that the PGA Tour has come close to finalizing, we'll probably announce later this week, the finalization of the 4 rotating elevated events that'll be on the PGA Tour schedule for 2023. So, as you might recall, at the Tour Championship, the Commissioner Jay Monahan announced that there would be elevated events, and these events would all feature, at least the PGA Tour controlled ones, purses of $20 million. All the top players, the top 20, 25 players, what have you, would agree to play in those tournaments, and if they were eligible, of course. And then they would have 4 elevated events that they hadn't announced, and they would get back to us on that, and then you would have 3 tournaments that were up to the discretion of the player, and that would bring them to 20 tournaments, meaning all the top players would compete at least 20 times, and at least 17 of those would be events where the top players are guaranteed to be there. And so you have the 4 major championships. Obviously the PGA Tour doesn't control those, so they can't necessarily say the purse is going to be $20 million, but you can kind of get the wink and the nod there that they're going to increase it to $20 million probably for the majors, and then just leave it there for a little while. And then you're going to have the 3 FedEx Cup playoff events. You're going to have the players. You're going to have the WGC Dell Technology Match Play. You're going to have the tournaments that are considered the invitational, the special invitational tournaments, the elevated one. They elevated, last year or 2 years ago, the Genesis Invitational, which is hosted by Tiger Woods, the Arnold Palmer Invitational at Bay Hill, and then the Memorial Tournament, which is still hosted by Jack Nicklaus in Dublin, Ohio. And so they had 4 tournaments that they hadn't identified yet that were going to be these kind of special elevated events outside the ones that they control in the majors. And so Eamon reported that the PGA Tour is doing a great thing here. They're doing the right thing, and they're not permanently elevating 4 events every year and moving that into a whole stratosphere, which creates this very obvious set of at least 17 tournaments where the best players are going to compete and everybody else is fighting for the scraps of the other 3 starts that those top players are going to make. Instead, they will rotate those around and offer them every year to tournaments that haven't had that status yet. They will allow them to bump up for a year and move maybe around in the schedule to meet the demand for those tournaments, and so that they're spaced out properly. But that they'll have that opportunity as a pool each year. And then presumably if you had held it in recent memory, you won't get first crack, you'll get second crack at it after people who've never had it, tournaments have never had it, have the opportunity to step up and play for that bigger prize money, obviously conferring with their title sponsors and presenting sponsors, trying to figure out whether they can even put that money together to get up to that $20 million level and have an elevated tournament. Because for some of these events, most tournaments now on the PGA Tour are in the $8 million range, basically in terms of a purse. Let's exclude the opposite field events, which would be pretty amazing if they decided to step up and become an elevated event for a year, but we'll put those aside for a minute. And so most purses are kind of around that almost $8 million mark. So for the lower end, you're talking a $12 million bump in purse for 1 year. On the higher end, maybe $8.5, $9 million, even $9.5 million. You're talking a tournament that probably has to put closer to $11 or $12 million in the pot to get that elevated status. That's a lot of money for 1 year. That's not nothing. And they will probably get those returns back in terms of attendance and added costs and higher ticket prices and all of those things. But that's a lot to put on the line to have the best players in the world guaranteed to come to your tournament. Still, having that opportunity is making it available to everybody is a very smart thing. And that means you can take your tournaments and keep them relevant and give them the opportunity to do what they want to do. Or you could be like a Sanderson Farms, which has said, hey, we're not worried about when the wraparound schedule goes away for next season. We'll be fine doing this because we've always done it this way. We've been community focused. We have not necessarily been field focused. So they may never step up. There may be some tournaments who have no interest in doing that. But there are 4 that have been identified for 2023. And those tournaments are the Waste Management Phoenix Open, the RBC Heritage, the Wells Fargo Championship, and the Travelers Championship. And if you think about what those 4 tournaments are and the level of sponsorship that's been associated with them historically and the level of support that they have from the PGA Tour fan base, it makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, the Travelers Championship is a tournament that puts in a lot of work and has put in a lot of work over the last decade. As Travelers, as the tournament staff, they're great. They work with fans, the media, the players. I mean, they really have their constituencies covered. They listen to them. They make changes. They update the golf course. They offer more amenities. They offer things for fans that improve the experience. They make it really easy for media people like me to cover them with good information. So they're very much invested in this, and it makes sense for them to be one of the first tournaments that are outside those kind of special events to be a rotating elevated event. Waste Management Phoenix Open makes all the sense in the world. And I know that there was some conversation about the possibility initially of this being a rotating cast of events, saying, well, maybe we don't need the Phoenix Open to be an event because it already attracts some of the best players in the world, a lot of the best players in the world, and obviously it attracts the most fans. So what's throwing more money at it going to do? Well, throwing more money at it's going to guarantee you at least the top 20 players in the world, and you're probably looking at 35 or 40 of the top 50 that are going to compete. Again, assuming kind of everything works out in the machinations of the official World Golf Ranking, where most of the LIV players are going to be out of the top 50 in the world by this time next year. It's just the way it's going to work. So you're going to have most of the world top 50 competing in that event. That makes sense. The RBC Heritage, RBC is a huge sponsor of the PGA Tour. They sponsor this event. They sponsor the Canadian Open, obviously. They have players that are on their staff. They immediately kicked Dustin Johnson to the curb and Graham McDowell to the curb. The second they signed with LIV Golf, they are very much in tune with the PGA Tour and what they want, and they're going to get it back in terms of sponsorship opportunity. And the week after the Masters is all of a sudden going to be a huge, huge tournament. It already attracted a really good field as it was. Now it's going to be an even bigger tournament because you're going to attract better players. Then you got the Wells Fargo Championship, which is kind of in that May time slot. This year it was in our neck of the woods here in the DC area, TPC Potomac and Evanell Farm, because of the 1 year off for hosting the President's Cup. And now it's going to be back at Quail Hollow. Quail Hollow has obviously elevated itself over the last couple of years as a venue, hosting the PGA Championship. It's going to come back there. They had the President's Cup. This tournament, when it was originally the Wachovia Championship, 15 years ago, when it started, almost 20 years ago, it was a tournament that had a huge purse at the time, and that attracted a really great field to the event. But then over time that kind of leveled off. Wells Fargo came in, has been a great sponsor, but they really haven't jacked up the purse necessarily to keep up entirely with the other purse increases on the PGA Tour. So now they're coming in, hey, we want to be in that big boy tier again. We'd like to put up to $20 million. We're going to get that field. So those are your 2023 tournaments. That is not absolutely official yet. The ink has not been dried on the contracts, but that's where it's going. So Eamon doesn't miss. He really doesn't. So that's where we're going to go with these elevated tournaments. I think it's a great idea to be able to move these around. There are some question marks, of course. What will these tournaments look like in 2024? Because if they're not going to be an elevated event, because you're going to extend that opportunity to other events, will they just go back to being tournaments that have whatever the purse was last year plus $800,000-$900,000, as you would expect the increases to continue because of the prize money put in part by the PGA Tour with their television rights contract? So will it just go back to that, or will it be some kind of like middle ground? Will it be $12, $13, $14 million? I think some of that's TBD. And then the other part of it that is still TBD for 2024, not necessarily for this year, so it seems that the field size may change for these events when they become elevated for 1 year, but at least for this year, they will not. It's too late in the game for that. So each of those tournaments will have their standard number of players. The Phoenix Open is 132, Same, it's 132 or 120 for the Heritage. You have 156 for the Wells Fargo. That might go to 144. And then you have same number for the Travelers. Again, open event in the summer months, so you can have maximum field. So those events in the future that are the rotating elevated events may say, hey, we only want 100 players or 120 players or 70 players, whatever that number is. That may come up, that may not. You will see. But at least for 2023, these are the tournaments that are stepping up into that role and becoming the elevated events. So very interesting news on that front. Now, the other story I want to get to today is a really long, interesting profile in the New Yorker. I read it last night. I think you should read it today if you have some time. It probably will take 20, 25 minutes of your time, or they have one of those audio players where you can listen to somebody read it to you. It takes 43 minutes. You can read it faster than that. I would strongly recommend not listening to it being read back to you. But it's by a guy named Zach Helfand. I don't know Zach. I've never met Zach. But he does this story for the New Yorker. David Owen does a lot of this stuff. He's a great, great writer. But he didn't do this one. And so for the sporting scene story, the story is entitled, Will the Saudis and Donald Trump Save Golf or Wreck It? And so it's kind of a look at Trump's involvement as a two-time tournament host for LIV, one already, one coming up with the event at Doral to close the Invitational Series before they go to the LIV Golf League, whatever that looks like next year. But more importantly, I think for our purposes, it gives a great window, almost too good of a window, into the Saudis who are behind this business, this function. In part, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, which is their sovereign fund worth hundreds of billions of dollars and kind of has this mandate to generate returns, and not only generate returns, but also generate business for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which under Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, when he formally becomes the ruler of Saudi Arabia, he's going to look to try to turn Saudi Arabia from an oil exporter that's the primary function of their economy to something that seems more attractive to the world around them. Now, that might seem strange to you given their human rights record and how they're perceived by a lot of the world and how they treat people and all that. But I think that top line point is a great insight into the rest of it, because it gives you an idea of where MBS's head is at and what he thinks can happen with just insane amounts of money thrown at something. And I think that attitude is pervasive among the Saudis involved with LIV Golf, because they think they can just throw tons and tons of money at stuff and they'll get what they want. And one of the most interesting, in my opinion, parts of the piece is where they're talking about, where Zach writes about some interest from the Saudis all in on golf, and as they were kind of getting things going and building LIV, they wanted to have a player function at the Masters. They wanted to have an opportunity to host potentially interested players, and I'm certain that they did that, but they initially approached Augusta National Golf Club, a club, very small club, of millionaires and billionaires, and went to them and asked if they could rent out the clubhouse for a meet and greet. And of course, Augusta National said, no, you can't do that. We're Augusta National. You're not. You can't do that. And the Saudis were somewhat offended. They one of the gentlemen involved said, it's like they don't know how to do business. And I think the intriguing thing about this is that the Saudis involved seem to believe doing business involves dangling enormous, overvalued sums of money at something and then waiting for people to cave to the economic reality of what that money can mean for them. And that happened for a lot of players going to LIV, right? I mean, Dustin Johnson was kind of playing the Saudis a little bit. He eventually negotiated with them to the point where he just couldn't say no. They kept upping the ante, and eventually he said yes. And I think that's probably happened with some other players. Pat Perez, not one of them. Pat Perez got a deal and took it probably on the first offer. Maybe he added $1 to it, but he, thought that was very important. And Davis Love III says, he's quoted in the piece saying about DJ, he told me I got to a number where I'm willing to take the consequences. And DJ gets a rap for being kind of a dumb guy. He's not a dumb guy. He plays a dumb guy, but he's not a dumb guy. He's very savvy. And he made a choice. He did the game theory, although I'm sure he doesn't call it game theory, but did the game theory and said, hey, I'm willing to take this money for this 3-5-year contract, and gamble that when it's over, I will have a whole lot more money and I'll be able to go back to playing some measure of golf like the way I did before, whether that's on the PGA Tour or in the majors or whatever, and I'm willing to deal with that. So that's kind of interesting. Max Homa was also quoted in the piece that I thought was particularly compelling, and he said he got an email from LIV, from the Saudis, with an offer, and he never read it. He said he didn't want to read it because his wife would get mad at him if he was offered whatever amount of money that was, and he didn't take it and didn't agree. So he didn't want to know, so he couldn't say yes. And Rory Mcilroy, on the other hand, comes across as a guy who's, again, quoted in the piece, who said he's going to make a shitload of money out on the PGA Tour. Shit ton was the official word. Shit ton money on the PGA Tour. And that's right. He's a great player. And all of this is going to work out in his favor. He has negotiated something, along with Tiger and the rest of the top players, that's going to fundamentally make them insane amounts of money. Well, at least relatively insane to the way the PGA Tour was. Now, a lot of this money was going to come out because of the increased television rights fees that were coming. They were going to be worked in over a longer period of time. But now they've come to fruition very quickly because of LIV. So the timing of it has been LIV related. The money, maybe not so much. But these guys are going to benefit. And they have fundamentally changed what the PGA Tour looks like in terms of these elevated events we just discussed. So, yeah, the players involved, I think we tend to think of them as maybe not as clever as they are. And I don't know if they are clever or they're greedy or timing's right. Maybe a little bit of everything. And maybe it's different from player to player. But at the end of the day, some people that went to LIV got what they wanted and were willing to take the consequences. And the people that stayed on the PGA Tour were willing to step up and negotiate what they wanted their future to be for the tour. Both of them took advantage of the situation. Meanwhile, the Saudis have this viewpoint that they can just pretty much buy what they want and how they want it. And they think they can just throw money out there and that it's not going to be a problem. Except it is a problem. It doesn't work out that way. And ultimately, you've got these guys who are kind of running this operation outside of Greg Norman. And the intrigue about the piece is not only how much they talk about dangling money and just assuming that they can buy everything, but just kind of the brazen nature in which they talk about it, in which they kind of say, yeah, we could buy whatever we want. We could do what we want because we've got the money to be able to engineer it. And that they're happy that they've, got these players on board and all of this stuff. But one of the other underscoring pieces is why I still don't one of my takeaways from the piece is why Greg Norman is still in charge of LIV. Because it is very apparent that Norman, one, speaks out of school relative to the Saudis and what they want. Two, a lot of the players hate him. They just don't like the guy. And they've held decades long, in the case of Tiger Woods, or years long grudges against Greg Norman. I don't think really anybody probably signing with LIV loves Greg Norman that much, to be honest with you, because either you see through him as a poor businessman that just kind of traded on his name for a long time, or as someone you just don't like. And he's been such a grating public force for LIV, it's kind of hard to understand why the Saudis are still working with him, other than to think maybe he is enough of a provocateur that he is worth holding on to for at least a little while longer. But at the end of all this, with the Saudis saying, hey, we're going to... one more thing before we kind of get to the main takeaway of all of this. And the really interesting point in, I guess, February, March, when it looked like this concept was going to die out. And frankly, Jay Monahan thought he had won and thought it was over and done with, because he had gotten that sense from players who were basically lying to his face about what status was with LIV, and ultimately then went to LIV in several cases. But it is an intriguing kind of anecdote where the Saudis are talking to each other and they say, well, do we go through with what we've done, or do we just kind of can this whole thing? And I think the most interesting part of that is where they say they're going to do it, and you go get the greatest mediocres, the highest mediocres you can. We'll throw a $25 million purse at it and go from there. So if you think about that first field for London, the Centurion Club event, the folks that played, other than the obvious kind of higher level signings, to me, it's clear that the Saudis didn't think very highly, and maybe don't think very highly, of the players they initially got. But they were the players that they got, so they feel that they weren't great, but they are also quoted in the story talking about having to kind of protect those players because they were willing to step out of the PGA Tour and do this. So on one hand, they don't necessarily think the highest of them, but at the same time, they appreciate them, I guess is the right, I don't know. They feel some sense of loyalty to them because they were willing to take a chance. So the whole takeaway from this is, in the end, the Saudis think that they can buy what they want. And this may not necessarily be a sports washing exercise in the sense that it's sports washing about improving the attitude of Saudi Arabia. Clearly that hasn't worked. But that the point of view may be a different type of sports washing. Because sports washing Saudi Arabia as a destination for golf and for rich people to go and to invest, which is what we talked about. It's not necessarily reputational for everybody. I don't think that's going to change because of golf. Frankly, this is not the mechanism to do it. But rather, to have that conversation about whether Saudi Arabia is a place to invest your business for the future and whether or not you're willing to tolerate what MBS puts forward as a government and the amenities that they may offer to investors in the long haul compared to the restrictive environment in which people exist every day in Saudi Arabia socially. That's the end of it. That is the point. But that this is not something that will just continue in perpetuity. That the Saudis have effectively agreed to this, to run this for 5 years. It may not last that long, but they've agreed to run it for 5 years. I mean, they're in charge. They can cut it off when they feel like. But at that point, they will want their money back. They will want to monetize these franchise things that they believe they have created with these 12 teams, many of which their team names are going to change because the players don't like them, and they weren't really well put together or named very well. But a number of these players, the top players, some kind of quote-unquote equity stake, not in the league, although I do believe some players have that, a very small one, but in the teams, and that they will try to sell these teams to other owners for large amounts of money. Now, the value of that is obviously predicated on a variety of things. 1, people paying attention. 2, television contract. 3, people caring that can invest that money and finding some kind of massive value in it. None of those things happen. LIV probably just dies on the vine in 5 years or less if it's apparent that that's not going to work. And at the end, maybe that's what happens here. Maybe this is just a blip on the radar in the grand scheme of the history of professional golf. But the piece is absolutely worth your time to read. I did not want to just go through and summarize the entire thing. Those are kind of the high-level takeaways of it, but I hope you read it. It is absolutely worth your time. There's a lot of insight in there, and I think reading the direct quotes from everyone involved gives you a better feel of where everyone is, and probably is the most insightful piece into LIV that I have read so far, into the machinations of it, why it exists, where it's going to try to go, all that stuff. And you're going to see the kind of main headline piece of, okay, well, if the majors don't admit LIV players, we'll just create our own, and we'll be happy about that. That probably is the most insightful quote into what I talked about, the brazen nature of the Saudi money, the Saudi investment, and what they think they can do with just money alone. And that the resistance of that in golf is particularly interesting because of the political nature of golf being so right-leaning in most places, particularly at a high level, that might typically align, especially with Trump being involved with the Saudis. But at the end of the day, they're kind of fighting against each other. So, well, let's take away from that piece. Like I said, it's 40 minutes if you just listen to it being read to you. You can read it 20 to 25. It's well worth your time today. All right, that's going to do it for us today on 2 Off the First. Thank you so much for the pleasure of your time listening to us. If you do listen to us through a podcasting service, give us 5 stars, tell a friend about us, helps us reach more people. Really appreciate it. We will talk to you tomorrow on 2 Off the First.